Coming up on the Branding Deep Dive podcast.
Coke is the easiest way to think of this. It's like the raw ingredients and then what that costs and then what the finished product, what people are willing to pay for. And if you can take a few pennies worth of raw ingredients and you can sell it for a couple of bucks because people like this combination of carbonation and syrup and whatever that's now called Coca-Cola and now elicits a feeling, well, that's part of brand equity. It's that extra amount that people are willing to pay.
This is Ahmed Shima, and welcome to the Branding Deep Dive podcast. If you're new here, this is a podcast where we have in-depth discussions with founders, marketers, and brand strategists on how to build a brand that people love. Today, we're talking to Shachar Meron. Shachar has 20 years of experience as a branding, advertising, and marketing executive and has worked with over 100 brands, including well-known brands like TransUnion, Boeing, McDonald, Intuit, Johnson & Johnson, Nordstrom, Cars.com, Motorola, and Abbott Labs. He currently serves as a partner and creative strategist at Bluegreen Branding, where he helps brand and marketing leaders, primarily from tech and finance companies, create brands that stand out from all the noise. Shachar is also a senior lecturer who teaches advertising and brand strategy at the University of Illinois, where he's also earned his bachelor's and master's degree in advertising. Over the past 9 years, he has won several teaching awards. Shachar is a regular contributor at Branding Mag and was featured as a speaker at AMA Brand Smart, the leading conference for brand marketers in the United States in Chicago this April. In this episode, we dive deep into brand communication, running branding workshops, how to measure brand equity, and much, much more. If you don't know where to start with your company's branding, this episode is a must listen. Now, here's Shachar. So you work with brands, for people that are listening to this audience, a lot of them may be in the small business world. We have a couple clients a couple listeners that run brick and mortar shops. For them, how do you really think through branding at your agency? What kind of work do you do for customers? And how do you think through branding for them?
Yeah. So, it depends on their experience with brands. Everybody knows what brands are, right? We live in a world of brands. We know what they feel like. But sometimes when you ask people to define it, it gets a little squishy. So I find it's helpful if I'm working with, say, like a startup or a small business who doesn't live in this world every day. Even though they do, they don't realize it. I talk about brand as its reputation and an image. This is what people know about you. It's inseparable from your business. Sometimes describing like business and brand are not the same thing, but they should be so close. They almost feel like it. I've heard brand described as like the soul of your business, where the business side of it might be the more tangible aspects of it. The products that you make, the services you provide, the employees, et cetera. And then the brand comes down to things like what people think about you and feel about you, where you exist in the mind of the consumer. It always comes down to, this is when I shift to teacher mode, about how your brand is not what you say it is. It's what they say it is, meaning your public, your customer. You can't force somebody to think and feel about your business the way you want them to. But if you're very intentional about it, you can shift people in the right direction. You can make sure that certain messages or images come to mind when they think of your business. And then when they're in a situation, your customers are in a situation where they might be buying, for example, from you. You exist in the right spot in that short list in their mind. And hopefully that gives them the extra look. It drives them to, say, your digital platforms or to actually walk into your store. And then kind of you got it from there, right? We hopefully got the right person in front of you in the right mindset. And then, good luck. So that's if I'm working with, more brand laymen, that's what I talk about. But business owners, I work with startup and small business owners much of my life. And they get it instantly. They have their own issues going on and they see how this connects with their world.
Yeah. And so when it comes to actually changing, a prospect or potential customer's perspective on, the thoughts and associations and feelings they have with, your brand, what are some things that you can actually do to influence that perception people have? So I instantly I'm thinking of, I just did like a video, or I just shot a video on like Ferrari. And I'm sure if you're familiar with Ferrari and how they sue certain customers if they do things that they feel are kind of like outside of what represents their brand. And so, I think that's kind of like an interesting take is how far is too far? How do you actually influence the perception that potential customers have? And so at the small business and, the business owner level, how are you actually thinking through influencing these perceptions that customers may have of the brand.
Yeah, and it's funny you mentioned that. I do enjoy the Ferrari brand, and I was familiar with that. It gets a little touchy when a brand like Disney, which tries to come off as touchy-feely loving, when they start cease and desisting people, it comes off a little different. But yeah, we're breaking brands down to usually their building blocks, and a lot of the things I do with clients are rebranding. They already exist, and they need to kind of replace what they have, or if they're starting up from scratch. But we talk about things like positioning and persona just as examples of what you might do to influence how people feel about your brand. Positioning is all about that place you occupy in your customer's mind, like I talked about earlier. You can shape that. What you need to do is be very focused. You need to find some sort of a message that you can really own and that is really just focused on one thing. The biggest mistake that many businesses make, I would say small businesses, but honestly, it's most businesses. It's not that they pick the wrong thing to focus on. It's that they refuse to choose one thing. They always want to hedge their bets. Lots of businesses, that you end up with a web page that has like a 3-part headline because they couldn't pick anything. They're like, well, we're about quality and service and history and whatever. Let's just say it all right there in the headline. So I think, one of the biggest things you can do is be really intentional, make some choices. Think through, what do we want to be known for? Is it something that's meaningful to our audience that they already care about? That's also really important, understanding your target audience and where they are in their life and positioning your brand so that it fits in with that. You can't force people to think about something or care about something that they don't. But if you can kind of intersect with the way that they do things, your customers, and say like, okay, our brand stands for this. And then really just be able to just keep delivering on that. Make sure that you have the discipline to not switch it up after a few weeks because you got bored or antsy. But if you've actually put some research and time into thinking like this is the right message, then seeing it through. And then, keeping an eye on it, changing things up over time if something's really not resonating, testing, et cetera. Also things like brand persona, it's not always about positioning and carefully selecting a message that resonates and coordinates and all that. Sometimes it's like, what is the vibe that we put out there? What is the personality of our brand? How does that compare to, say, what our customers like, what our competitors are throwing out there? And then again, just delivering on that consistently. So if it's like our brand has a personality of like, if you want to get into brand archetypes or something, but, we're a caregiver. We really have a nurturing kind of a feel. That's great. Just make sure that you continue to follow through on that. There's many times I've seen brands and have worked with brands that say, we have this kind of persona that we put out there. But then when they start to communicate, they just put out the same jargon that everybody else is putting out. So it's about being intentional, but then also just having the discipline to keep seeing it through.
Yeah, I think one of the things that you brought up that is interesting that I see when I work with small businesses, especially, is that like, a lot of times small businesses that are kind of, smaller shops, they're doing like a lot of things for a lot of different people, and they'll basically just take on like any customers, right? And so when we're talking about positioning, for them, it's a little bit hard to actually, narrow down and pick the messaging for like one customer. So when you're working with, a customer like that, how do you actually decide what to actually narrow in your messaging around and position yourself on? Like, how do you decide, like, let's say you have, 3 different kinds of avatars that, are regularly coming into your shop and they enjoy what you're doing. How do you decide like which one to like double down on and really create messaging around, or can you do multiple?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's sort of like a 2-part question. Your last thing that you said, can you do multiple? I actually like to tell clients, we can say everything you want, but not all at the same time. That usually gets a chuckle, but then it also calms them down a bit. I think their big fear, like you just said, is they want to say a number of things and they're afraid that by choosing one, they're just removing all other messages. Like, I don't get to say anything else. You do get to say other things, but you only have one shot to actually grab somebody's attention. Otherwise, they're just going to move on within seconds. So it's important to just kind of like almost rank in order, like what is it that we want to say? And the way you determine what to focus on, actually, my background's as a copywriter before I was a strategist, and used to do exercises all the time with clients where, we set up a grid. We talk about like, okay, this axis is how good you are compared to your competitors on a particular trait. This axis is all about, the x-axis is all about how much does your target audience care. Strategists love our different tables and tools. There's almost always different types of axes you can put down. But the important thing is to just give people like a framework to look at things through, and then actually talk about aspects of your business and brand that are potential messages, that are contenders, and say like, all right, let's talk about this one here. You guys say that customer service is a potential winning message. You say that you're really great at it and that you're the best at it, or you do it differently than your competitors. And you say that your customers really care about it, your research, or just anecdotally, this matters to them. Let's literally see where it appears on this grid. And I'll have conversations with clients and teams, and they'll say like, oh yeah, we're the best at it. Everyone says so. And then somebody else will be like, now, wait a minute. I mean, I know we say that, but guys, that we had this kind of whole issue where we had turnover. Oh, that's right. Well, and actually it turns out that all of our competitors do the exact same thing that we do on customer service. Okay, that's right. So you start to actually, when you think through some of these points critically, you actually start to see we're not the best at everything, and our customers don't care about everything. And in fact, going through these conversations, turns out this point plots in the top middle and this point plots in the bottom right, depending on our criteria. However it is that you do it, the important thing is you get those conversations going with the right people on the client side. I've worked with small businesses where it's just us working with the owner. I've worked with, Fortune 500 companies where it's 15 people in the room of different disciplines. The important thing is you just get people who understand your customers and your business. And then again, it's like you might find coming out of an exercise like that, then eventually step back. You've plotted maybe a dozen points over like a 2-hour conversation. I'm a big fan of workshops, just being my background. And when you take a step back, you see patterns emerge. And it's like, this one message really did emerge in the upper right corner. It's the one message that we all agreed we're great at and that our customers really care about. That has the potential to be a main message. That could be, informing our headline on our website, but it's not the only thing we say. Those other messages that we liked that kind of like didn't quite emerge there, that's fine. That's the second message. That's the third message. That's the thing that you click through to. That's the thing you get to if we're 15 seconds into a video and somebody's still paying attention. So first by just critically looking at it and organizing messages, and then applying it by thinking like, how does this roll out, in digital content or advertising or video?
Now I want to shift gears a little bit. I know you're a professor at the University of Illinois. Just curious to see your perspective on this, because I've seen a couple different perspectives on this, especially from some of the guests we've had on. But when it comes to explaining branding versus marketing, right? How do you make that distinction for your students and the people and the clients you talk to? And then how do you explain what the differences are and what the similarities are? And then I don't want to give you too many questions at the same time. So let's start with that. And then I got a couple of follow-ups to that.
Yeah, for sure. It's funny because I work in the advertising department, and this is also where I studied, by the way. And marketing at this university is actually in a different college. We're here in advertising in the College of Media, and then marketing's over in the College of Business. My students sometimes think, or the marketing students think, that they're in two completely different worlds. Advertising is about this, but marketing is about that. And I have to explain, no, advertising's kind of a subset of marketing. They overlap. I sometimes use examples like if marketing is rectangles and advertising is squares, it's it's a type of rectangle. It's the most well-known type, but it's still just another type. I would actually, though, say that they're all really just subsets of brand communications, which is that if a brand wants to communicate with its audiences, it has a lot of different ways to do that. Some of it is paid, some of it is unpaid, some is digital, some is physical. Some are things that actually cost money and manifest in really official ways. Other things are just here's some talking points for your salesperson. But brand communications is the umbrella that I put over all of those things. It's the brand that has a message and a voice and an audience. And then the way that it chooses to communicate, hey, if it happens to be advertising, here's some additional principles and things to keep in mind. And if it happens to be marketing, here's some other things to look at. If I'm talking to relative laymen, they don't necessarily know the world of brand, but marketing is an instant connector for them. So it's a helpful way for them, a shortcut for them to know what it is we're talking about. It's interesting, though, because for such a long time, for most of my career, my clients are chief marketing officers. If I'm not talking to the actual owner or president of a business, I'm talking to somebody usually in the marketing discipline. But that's just because that's how businesses have been set up for years, is that the brand often lives at that marketing level. And more recently, I'm encouraged to see that brand exists. It elevates. It exists more at the overall company level. People get it's not just a marketing's thing. You don't want it to ever be that thing of our marketing person, is asking us to do that thing on Friday afternoon. And then we have now that poster hanging up in the wall that means something to us. It's no, if it's a good brand, it's infused into every part of the business and the way people think and behave. And then the marketing and advertising is just easy. It's just a way that comes to life through some of the channels.
Yeah, so that's interesting. I never heard it broken down like that with the brand communications. Now, I think you kind of answered this with the last piece of your answer, but if you were a small business or even like a Fortune 500 company and you're starting from scratch, let's say it's a rebrand, where do you actually start in the brand communication workshops that need to happen for the company, right? Do you start with a branding workshop and then work your way to like advertising and marketing, or like how does that work? What's the order of operations for figuring all this stuff out for a company?
Yeah, absolutely. It's funny because like many times for bigger companies, this is a process that takes months. It involves lots of stakeholders. Sometimes for small businesses, it's like, all right, guys, we're doing that branding workshop in the morning. Let's see what we can get done between 9 and 12. Let's have some lunch. And then we'll revisit in the afternoon, the advertising side. Sometimes you just got to be scrappy if that's what the budget and time allows. But yeah, the way that it would break down, if somebody really was, when you say from scratch, whether that means they're rebranding or from brand new, there's some of those really core things about a brand that we want to get to first. Things like mission, vision, values. This is something that earlier in my career was almost like a novelty to some businesses. They're like, we've been making widgets for 50 years. I guess we'll figure out some of that mission and value stuff that people care about now. I think that now people are just getting more sophisticated with brands. So they get like, listen, we might not necessarily be a mission or values driven company, but we recognize that there's something inherent to like what drives us, what gets us out of bed in the morning. If you are talking to a smaller business and like the president is also the founder and this was their baby, they have that, they may not have articulated it as a brand mission or values, but it's like, it's part of their story. It's part of, that one amazing day that they sat down at midnight upset with the world and they wrote out something and it became their business. There's so many stories like that. When you get past mission and values and things like that, then we get into things like positioning. These are exercises that are based on already understanding our target audience at least a little bit. So if I'm in a workshop and we're trying to really make the most of a couple of hours, the assumption is that we've already done some homework on who their target audience is. This is where I check in with business owners and or marketing people or whatever, and hopefully they understand their customers at least a little bit. Hopefully they understand not just the demographics but also the psychographics. They may have already done some research, whether it's formally or informally in the past. We would already have all those things as inputs. So we would craft an exercise like around positioning around, all right, guys, you all say that this is your primary target audience and this one's your secondary target audience. You've already given us information about your own company and the services that you provide or will someday provide if you don't exist yet. Then we can do some of those exercises like I was describing earlier. Let's plot some potential messaging points. Let's bring in this other tool because you happen to know, maybe a little less about your customers, but a little bit more about your competitors. There's all kinds of different ways that it can go. But you do have to kind of eventually triangulate all that information. So sometimes in the workshop, you're collecting it for the first time. And other times you're kind of making bigger steps. There's things like persona exercises, like I described earlier. Those are the things that sometimes, you would see a bunch of C-suite executives cutting out pictures out of magazines and making little collages. It seems a little bit like, summer arts and crafts camp. But the fact is you're trying to get people to think in a certain way. How would we compare ourselves in terms of our personality or our tone of voice to other brands? Again, if I was imagining like a morning workshop, you also need to give human beings a break. If they've just had an hour-long exercise where they're carefully analyzing their audience and their messages, they need a bit of a breather. So let's, do the more emotive part of our brainstorming and figure things out. I don't expect that in the room, whether that's a physical room or like a Zoom call, I don't expect that we're going to crack everything. But the expectation is a series of half-hour, 1 hour exercises. Could then mean that coming off that meeting, I can take it, my team can take it, we can push things further, we can circle back to their team. Rarely is it like a, we are coming back to you with all of the answers and you are just going to say, yes, that's it. It's usually a collaborative process back and forth. Once you have that kind of stuff figured out, and there's other things too, I'm skipping past things like brand architecture, for example. Very important to know, are we talking about a company brand? Or are we talking about a product brand? Or is it a company brand that has a series of products that get organized under different, families or whatever? So figuring out brand architecture is important. If it's a company that doesn't have a name yet or is going to get renamed, we do a lot of brand identity, which is a total blast and really brings together that strategic and creative skill set. But things like naming, later logo design, you're not going to take care of all these things, in a day. But if some of those core things are figured out, like positioning, persona, based on like your understanding of your audience, then you can start to shift to things like, all right, let's talk about naming. What are some brand names that we like? Let's talk about a naming strategy. Do you want to have a name that literally describes what it is that you do, like a 5-Hour Energy or 1-800-Flowers? Or do you want a name that doesn't literally say anything? It's just an abstract kind of name that has the right vibe, like Xerox. Or is it something in between? Our name is Duracell because we are durable batteries. There's all kinds of different ways you can do it. But before you just start brainstorming names, you want to make sure strategically you're in the right zone, or else you're wasting a bunch of time. So it tends to be, a lot of back and forth and back and forth. You can get a lot done in a relatively short period of time. I find the most time consuming parts, honestly, are getting buy-in and alignment from all the stakeholders. Sometimes I love working with a small business founder because they are it. If you can convince them, I've had presentations where like, here's a name we suggested. They're like, that's it. They make the decision in the room. More commonly, it's like, here we are after a few months of kind of making sure everybody's been involved and people are bought into what we're doing. Now let's discuss these options and see what people have to say. That takes a little time.
Yeah. One of the things I was going to ask you is, how is it different working with like small businesses versus like Fortune 500 companies? Sounds like the speed and getting buy-in is one of the things, but are there any other like differences when it comes to like, doing these workshops with, small businesses versus bigger companies? I would assume another thing is like, small businesses, especially like startups, may not have as much data on the customers because they're still trying to figure out, who it is that they're trying to serve. And they maybe haven't hit like a critical mass of customers yet. But yeah, from your perspective, are there any other differences when you're doing these workshops, like small versus big company?
Yeah, I think that bigger companies it takes longer. I kind of laughed at them earlier for that, but the reason is because the stakes are higher, and there's more money involved, more time involved, more people involved. So you really want to get it right. The smaller companies, it's a big deal to them for sure. For many people, this is their entire livelihood wrapped into this business that you really need to take off. But you can be a little bit scrappier, and you don't have to have it all figured out by the time things launch. You can then track performance of things and test things out and make tweaks as you go. Doesn't mean that like you came up with an overall strategy and identity for a brand, and if it's not clicking after a few weeks, you change it. But you can absolutely, based on thinking things through, you can launch something and say, have a digital presence or do a soft launch and try to drive some people to things, or talk to people that are in your target audience. You may not be doing a scientific study of like, we did a survey with this many responses. Sometimes it's just like, I have a brain trust of like 4 or 5 people that are in my target audience and they know our industry, and I just trust what they have to say, or they're actually a customer of mine. And when I think about, why my business will take off, this is who I think about. So they bounce things off of them and they get some feedback. And it's very much the decisiveness factor. A small business owner can then make a decision of like, based on what I'm hearing, I'm going to decide to do this or change that. Larger organizations, they don't do it on a whim, but the smart ones do keep track of these things. So they're not just like investing a bunch of time and money, flipping a switch, and then sitting back and seeing kind of what will happen. But it is kind of like, I picture, it's like a giant ship. If a big business is rebranding, it's a really slow turn. But once you're facing the right way, you can go, cross Atlantic if you want to at that point. If you want to, if you're doing it for a small business, you be fast, you can maneuver, but you can't necessarily go the same distance without making a few stops and changing.
Mm-hmm. Now, another thing that I feel I've kind of nowadays is kind of I'm running into less and less, but like I feel like one of the things that, especially working with like most of my work I do is like with smaller businesses, and so one of the things you have to do is like convince them that like they should be investing in, branding and, taking like the time to actually understand who their customers are. And then, think through what kind of like positioning, how do you want to position yourself and that kind of thing. And so from your perspective, like, how is it that you're actually explaining the value of branding? And then like, can you, this is one of the things that I always find fascinating is that like, especially even in a lot of like branding studies and stuff like that, there's not a lot of like data that you can kind of come back and point to, right? Like at a high level, right? Like if you look at like Professor Scott Galloway and kind of the work he does, he'll use like branding decisions and stuff like that, and he'll point it back to like overall stock performance. Mm-hmm. But like there's so many things that go into like stock performance. It's like, was it really this like change in color that resulted in like a 10% increase in stock. And so what I'm curious about is like, how do you actually explain like the business value of these things to your customers? And like, is there a way that you can actually put, how do you actually measure the performance of these changes for your clients?
Yeah, great question. I actually, there's a publication called Branding Mag and a website that I write for quarterly. And I wrote one on this like a year ago, sort of like, what is brand equity? What is brand value? How do you measure it? There's so many metrics out there, which means also that means nobody's agreed on one way of doing it. By the way, I love the shout out to Scott Galloway. I'm a big fan. And I enjoy his book, The Four, where he talks about like the 4 big brands that run our lives basically right now, like Google, Apple, Amazon, Facebook, I think it was at the time. So I know that he's thought a lot about this kind of stuff. It kind of takes me back to something when you were telling me a bit about your intro before this call about you got into brands thinking about why do people pay more for certain things. So there's a few different ways to look at it. I like certain resources like Interbrand has a list of the 100 most valuable brands. They have their own methodology that they break down. It's like you look at the big, most valuable brands in the world and, Apple, Microsoft is actually still fairly high up there, et cetera. How do you compare something like that to Coca-Cola, right? How do you compare the apples and oranges like that? There's a few ways to look at it. One of the ways I look at Coke is the easiest way to think of this. It's like the raw ingredients and then what that costs and then what the finished product, what people are willing to pay for. And if you can take a few pennies worth of raw ingredients and you can sell it for a couple of bucks because people like this combination of carbonation and syrup and whatever that's now called Coca-Cola and now elicits a feeling, well, that's part of brand equity. It's that extra amount that people are willing to pay. Part of it is like you just described when it comes to things like stock price, when it comes to corporate reputation and image lists that things appear on. There's all kinds of studies and nobody's found one way of doing it. I found that when I've worked with smaller businesses, they are, in terms of do we have to explain to people the value of brands? I've worked with small businesses for a lot of my career. And earlier in my career, I was totally ready to like convince people like, hey, you should work with us because it's worth investing in your brand. That's an uphill climb. Earlier in my career, I owned a different agency that was a brand design firm. And it was very important for us that small businesses appreciate the value of brand because we want to get paid more for our services. We don't want to be commoditized. But that's kind of a painful thing to have to persuade somebody that your stuff is worth it before they then choose you over, say, a competitor. So later in my career, my partner and I at Bluegreen have said, at this stage, we don't want to have to work with clients anymore that have to be convinced to do this. We want to work with people that already believe they need to do it, but they might need to still see it quantified somehow so they can convince other people. Right. Maybe they have to convince their team or their partner or their CEO that it's worth investing in brand because this is what you get out of it. So normally it then does work. We will help people actually make the case for their own people, but we have to understand their own business a little bit better and why their customers choose things the way that they do. And if it works out that like, you work in an industry where there's like the big 3 and you're number 3, then that's fine. That means we understand that our job is to make sure that we get preferred over the other 2. And what is that worth for you monetarily to say close a higher percentage of your sales? So you're right that you can't just isolate one metric and say that's it, but you can cobble together a series of matrices, and then if that's enough to convince people it's worth it, then you have to follow up on it. And as you roll things out, you have to actually measure those things. But it does usually factor in some of the more traditional metrics of things like, click-throughs, things like pricing strategies, all that kind of stuff gets rolled into it.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think that's interesting. I've also seen like Net Promoter Score and stuff like that. But another thing, so I saw a video of you, I think it was one of your classes explaining just branding. And one of the things you mentioned in there was how people can go brands that do branding effectively can take someone that is, from just like a regular customer to like a brand ambassador. Right. And so I wanted to just get a better understanding of this process, this evolution that happens in the customer's mind and really take a step back and understand how we as business owners if we want to actually make it more realistic, we can say let's say for this podcast, for example, if we actually want to turn people into brand ambassadors for the podcast, for the Branding Deep Dive podcast, how can we actually do that? Like, what are the steps that I need to take, or what are some things that I could do to take someone that is just listening to this podcast as a casual listener and then turn them into someone that like it will go out and share episodes when they come out?
Yeah, that's great. I'll go into professor mode again. The customer sales funnel, if that's what you're talking about. And a lot of times, if you talk to a small business owner who is, maybe in charge of their sales operation as well, they might consider it in relation to a pipeline. It's almost the same, right? Funnel, pipeline. I can kind of picture it. The idea being just that like people are not going to, after hearing one communication, they're not going to go from not knowing you exist to now being your biggest fan who buys your product. There are products out there that are cheap enough and simple enough that people can make a snap judgment. If I'm like checking out at a convenience store and I see a pack of gum that's a flavor I like, and maybe I never heard of it, or maybe I haven't thought about it until this moment, I might just go buy it. But if I'm buying a car, if I'm buying clothes, even if I'm just choosing where to go for a restaurant, usually I'm thinking things through a little bit more than that. So the customer sales funnel is meant to kind of represent the different stages that customers go through to go from awareness all the way through action or purchase, and then even further into being ambassadors. And I remember when I was a student in advertising, they would describe it as like a 4-step funnel. This is back where marketing was like, marketing is the 4 Ps. And related to that, your sales funnel is 4 steps. I believe it was like awareness, interest, preference, and action, or something like that, right? Action and purchase was the last one. And however you slice it, I remember the last one being action was like, oh, so like once somebody's bought from you, your job is basically done, right? And then now it's whether they like the product or not, now it's on them to just keep buying it. But in more modern times, people get there's more steps beyond just action. In fact, extra steps like loyalty and then being ambassadors, that's like the holy grail. That's like, hey, if I can get somebody to be a repeat customer, that's actually far more valuable than just getting somebody once. Repeat business ends up being so much more less expensive to get and more valuable to hold on to. Well, you approach strategies differently if you're trying to reach out to somebody who's already bought from you and try to get them to come back. It's a more of a targeted approach. You're not just telling them who you are because they already know that. You're trying to give them a reason to build some loyalty or some incentives. Being a brand ambassador is even further. It's not just like, I like this brand so much, I'm going to keep buying it, but I'm going to go out of my way to promote it to other people that I know. And I'm not talking about paid ambassadors. That's fine. I know people that are paid ambassadors, whether they're influencers or they work for the company. I'm talking about your fans. I'm talking about the people that are your ambassadors because they love you and they feel you, and they will share your posts on social media, and they will tell their friends about it. And they even get known in association with the brand. They have those stickers on their car or their laptop or whatever. They proudly display. It's like you get what that feeling is like. If you can get somebody to be a brand ambassador, they are worth so much to you. All you need to do is just keep them happy and they will do your job for you. Now, how do you do this? Well, again, you're not like this. This is often tied in with things like media planning. You're trying to choose which media to use, where to put your poker chips to get the best return. Well, if you're a relative unknown, you want to put most of your investment in that top of the funnel stuff. You've got to attract some of the right attention just to kind of like feed the funnel, just to get the right people to look at you. But if people already know you exist and maybe they're just not that into you, or they don't really get what's different about you, well, then you're a little lower in the funnel. You're in those second or third rungs where you're like, well, now I want to compare myself a little bit more to alternatives so they can see why life is better with my brand than with someone else. Or sometimes if you're in that mid funnel, it's like, you know what? They already are into me. I'm just trying to get them to act. I'm trying to get them off the fence and be like, you know what, now is the time. And advertising that is action oriented, that's where it's like you see a billboard driving down the interstate saying like, hey, get some McDonald's breakfast, exit 43C, take a right. They have a picture of McDonald's breakfast and they're done. They don't have to persuade you like what McDonald's is all about. They're talking to people who are already into it. They're just trying to convince you to go now. So depending, analyzing where your audiences are in the funnel and where you want to get them realistically, you can move them a few steps, maybe a couple of steps at a time, and then selecting media that work well, casting that wide net versus very targeted approaches. If I remember hearing from one of your past podcast episodes, did you have a background in Amazon? Is that right?
I did, yeah.
Yeah. So I know like Amazon is a great example of it's not always a linear process. People have their journey and sometimes they get to know a brand, they're interested. Well, now let's go check out some customer reviews. That is a step. And maybe by checking out the customer reviews, you're going to go buy afterwards if you like it. Or maybe now you're going to go out and go research a competitor. So people kind of go through these processes through all different loops. It's just important to kind of like map out what is my customer's journey and then how can I kind of intersect with them at the right moments.
Hmm. And so I think one of the things you're highlighting is that like it's not easy, right? So it takes a lot of work. And I think one of the things, especially with this, like there's this concept, and you've probably seen this too, where like you go on YouTube or you go on these like any social media platform, and you're like hit with these ads of like, hey, like you can get rich quick. Just do this one new tactic and you'll get whatever, right? You'll be pouring in, thousands and millions and stuff like that. But I think the reality is, like you're highlighting, is that like, you know, maybe when Facebook ads first started, you could get a lot of customers for cheaply. But then when the market gets saturated, it gets harder and harder to just use those same exact simple tactics, and you have to get more sophisticated with your approach, right? You can't just simply run Facebook ads, but now you have to start adding more things to your actual like repertoire of things that you're actually doing to acquire customers and then retain customers and do more. Yeah. And so I think like for the people that are listening, if you're if you're not actually thinking through like the full customer journey and how you're actually targeting people at those different phases, then you're leaving money on the table, and you're probably not turning people into raving fans where you could have.
Yeah, multimedia is definitely the way to go. Some of it is doing things that isn't even considered advertising or marketing. For example, people that have a storefront, being intentional with the layout and communications and decor within your store are touch points that are the little thing. Packaging, for example, after people have bought, sometimes is a big part of that emotional connection they get. But yeah, multimedia is always the way to go. Most of us ignore the vast majority of brand messages and ad messages that we see out there. We're such hypocrites sometimes in this world of people in branding and marketing like myself. We talk about like, oh, this is what our brand stands for, and this is the message that will resonate with people. But then as a consumer, I ignore the vast majority of things that people send out, and I can't wait to hit skip. And by the way, when we see ads for get rich quick, what we should be thinking is, what is it about my behaviors that this ad got shown to me? I exactly fit the profile of somebody apparently that wants to get rich quick because I'm listening to certain things or watching certain things. But yeah, doing multimedia and then testing, because you don't know which one thing is going to work. Odds are one thing won't work. Usually the average person needs to see a brand message about 7 times before they even pay attention. So, if it's always the same thing, maybe there's somebody who just constantly skips Facebook and Instagram ads. Maybe they're the kind of person, though, that does listen to podcasts and will listen to the word from our sponsor. Maybe they're the type of person that throws out any piece of mail that they get because it's junk, unless it's really cool, in which case they open it up. So sometimes then it's like, hey, instead of doing, 10,000 postcards everyone will throw out, maybe we just need to do 100 really cool pieces that goes to a very targeted list of people who already like us. So you do have to try out a bunch of stuff. It doesn't always work out the way that you thought. Even promoting my own agencies in the past, the things that we invested a lot of time and money and effort into didn't pan out. And the little throwaway thing that was barely an afterthought ended up being the thing that was the home run. But we never would have known if we didn't try a bunch of different stuff.
Yeah. That's part of what's so exciting and also what's so frustrating about the space that we're in.
Yeah. So. Yeah, it's good news though, because it means, listen, if it was just an algorithm and it was the same for everyone, then somebody like Google or Meta would just, rake in a few more $1 billion off that algorithm, and people like me would be out of a job. So I can't get too upset about it. But really, if it's like, hey, it kind of stinks promoting my brand or my business because things are constantly changing and I have to keep up. Yeah, that's just the way of life. It is part of that. Things get saturated. People that try new things or that are stronger find a way to push through. Others fall back.
And Shachar, for the audience that wants to kind of keep in touch with you or see your other works or work with Bluegreen Branding, where can they find you and your agency?
Yeah, so bluegreenbranding.com. That is where we have not only like breakdown of our work, but we also have a pretty robust insights and resources section at this point. My partner and I both come from a place where we want to teach and educate and empower people. If you need to do some do-it-yourself branding, this is great for especially the startups and the small businesses. You got some do-it-yourself branding you need to do, at least take it to a certain stage. We've got resources for you. You want to do some of your own messaging to run with your own team. You want to take a stab at rebranding and using a brand blueprint, interview your customers for some, voice of customer research. We have templates for all that stuff, plus articles that we've written on things like, how do you measure brand equity, blah, blah, blah. So check those kinds of things out. And I always tell people, if you think you might need services from a company like mine, check that out first. Maybe we've already got something for you where you don't need to hire somebody. But if that's the case, I'm glad. More power to you. I don't want to waste your time. and money. If it turns out that you check those out, you get a little bit further, but you still need some help, hey, reach out to somebody like me or somebody else. We can sometimes get you over the hump.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Shachar. Now, as always, I have my key takeaways from this episode, but before we get into that, I want to share a clip with you from our discussion with Stephen Horrigan on becoming a brand strategist.
Brand strategy is simply a plan for the brand to go to the market, okay? Now, for me, that plan is broken up into two sections. You have the method and you have the mode, okay? Now, the method is the brand, okay? That's the way you're going to do things, who you are as a brand, who you're for, who you're not, why you're different, what way you're going to show up, how are you going to look, how are you going to talk. These things don't change. This is the foundation for your brand. What you have after that is the mode. Now, this is your marketing strategy. Your marketing strategy are the different platforms that you're going to use, the different type of creative that you're going to use, the different types of steps in your funnel that you're going to use. So you have your method and you have your mode, and your method is your brand strategy.
If you enjoyed this discussion with Shachar, I am sure you'll also enjoy the episode with Stephen. Check it out wherever you're listening to this podcast. It is episode number 55. Now, here are my key takeaways. One of the ways you can measure brand equity is how much of a premium are people willing to pay for your product. And number two, if you want to take someone from a customer to a brand ambassador, you really have to think through how you're providing value at each different phase of the customer journey. And that is all for this episode. If you enjoyed this discussion, the easiest way to help out is to go to YouTube and subscribe to our channel. I'll leave the link in the description. We're really pushing to grow this channel right now. We have shorter case study videos on the channel, and it doesn't cost a thing to go subscribe. Thank you so much for listening. We'll see you next episode.